Hi, I'm Josh with Industrial Compressor Solutions, and I'm here with Aaron. We're going to show today how to change a air oil separator basket type on a rotary screw compressor. There's a little bit of variations across different models and such, but hopefully we'll be able to give a general level of understanding as to what has to happen. So first of all, we talk about de-energizing the equipment. Obviously this is something in our shop, so there's no power to it whatsoever. But when we talk about de-energizing, each plant is going to have a different lockout tagout procedure and different things that have to be done. So make sure that you work with the facility and make sure that all lockout tagout procedures are being followed properly. Compressed air isolation. As part of the lockout tagout, we have the electrical aspects, but we also have a compressed air side. In the air compressor, there is usually, and if you'll follow me, there's usually an isolation valve that will secure plant air from the air compressor. But even when that's done, we do not know if there's any air pressure behind this valve. Additionally, in between that valve, in between the isolation valve to the compressor and the separator that we'll be working on, is a minimum pressure check valve. In most cases, it's on top of the separator. Sometimes it's not. It can be an inline style check valve and it can be in other locations, but we need to have a good understanding if there is compressed air anywhere where we are working. So we really need to make sure that we look through the service manual, the parts manual, we ask somebody, but we want to be very careful that not only have we isolated the electrical, but that we've also isolated compressed air. Especially working on a separator, we don't want to trust whether the discharge isolation valve and or the minimum pressure check valve are going to save our lives. So we want to make sure that we're de-energized, and we want to be able to vent this air off. We want to be able to vent this air off as well as secure the electrical and make sure those are locked out. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the connecting piping. Some of the things that we want to talk about there is that we want to make sure we're using the right wrenches for the job. We don't want to use wrenches with teeth on them because that will mar the fittings and it'll make it where the technician can get hurt, and it can also just ruin the fitting as a whole. I should mention really quick that PPE is something to be a concern throughout this evolution. We've chosen, for the purpose of this video, to have safety glasses and gloves, but depending on the plant conditions, where you're working, and whatever other protocols in place, there might be more requirements that are needed besides that. So, but back to this. We want to make sure we're using the right size wrenches, and we don't want to be using wrenches with teeth on hex fittings. Have the right size wrenches and make sure that not only can you take it off and put it back on, but the person that comes after you can take it off and put it back on as well. So the first piece that we have to take off is the discharge piece, and that goes from the minimum pressure check valve over to the cooler. Now in some compressors and models, we find that this piece is being held in its location by the minimum pressure check valve. So we do want to make sure that we know that. It can also come into play when we're putting the lid back on. We need to know if that comes into concern or not. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the piping that discharges the separator tank, and that goes from the minimum pressure check valve to the cooler. We want to remove that, but we also want to remove that slowly because there there could be air, compressed air there, depending on how thorough our checks are. And even if you were thorough in your checks, take the time, be slow, careful, and make sure that you're not getting yourself into a bad scenario. The next thing that we're going to remove is a pressure line that comes. It's a little push to connect. We're going to move that. Now we have the blowdown line and a scavenge line left. All of these different manufacturers are going to have different configurations. Once again, make sure we're using the correct tools for the job. 3/4 open end and the 11/16. We're going to remove that. A little bit of best practices there. When he's first breaking that fitting, an open hand would prevent him from slipping off and possibly hurting himself on another piece of the cabinet. We want to be really careful, especially because there's heat. There's different ranges of heat when this compressor is running and off. Some of these fittings can get really hard to get on or off. So we want to make sure, keep an open hand when you're pushing away so that your hand doesn't fly off. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to take off the scavenge line. The scavenge line is a relatively, well, let's just say we need to be careful while we're pulling it off. It is a stainless steel or copper tube that extends down into the basket of the filter, and we want to make sure that we don't hurt that, break it, bend it, or whatever, if in chance we're not replacing it. I do usually suggest that we replace it, but for this example, we are just going to reuse the same one. All right, so I'll take these from you, sir. We have 9/16. There you are. Take these from you. Now, why don't we use a 1/2 and a 9/16 there? Now there will either be an orifice, a check valve, a combination of that somewhere in that line. But you know, we really just set that down there. And once we have that scavenge line loose, there's a couple different ways the scavenge line goes in here. A lot of times with the Ingersoll Rand, they actually bend. They bend the scavenge line, and so if they do that, it's not going to be good enough to just remove this top nut. We're going to want to use a wrench and pull off the fitting that connects it to the top of that sun. I notice on here, the technician that came and did this before us used Teflon tape to seal it. I'm not a huge fan of doing that. As you can see, we have Teflon tape that is coming off on the threads. We also have it here on this fitting. I really like to see like a Loctite 242 or a sealant that you can just use a drop or two to make it up. So we've removed everything from the top of this separator. We've removed all of the top of the separator, and the next step is going to be actually remove the lid of the separator. housing. Thank you very much for watching this video. We really appreciate it.